Great, let's get started. So I am Christine Larson, and I am the Rebele First Amendment Fellow in the Department of Communication. And this is my fourth year planning the Rebele First Amendment Symposium. And I am so delighted to see you all here. The idea for the symposium, for the last 4 years at least, is that we've tried to bring together scholars and academics with actual practitioners and see if their ideas match at all. And usually we have fascinating conversations and really productive connections. And I'm just so delighted with what we've produced every year, but especially this year. Before we get started, I wanted to say a special thank you to our sponsors of this event, my fellowship, and so much of what makes our journalism department special, Roland and Pat Rebele. Would you stand up? Thank you. They are not only generous, but really the most fun donors I've ever met, and we're lucky to have them. So I also want to thank Mark Dezzuti, wherever he is, from our staff department, for the Department of Communications, who really made all of this happen. The rest of the staff, thank you. Special thanks to our interim department chair, Jay Hamilton, who was tirelessly patient with all of the organization that went on and offered terrific advice. So my job here is just to quickly introduce our speakers. Our theme this year is Shaping Your Speech, Media Reform Past and Present. And we don't usually think about how things like media reform or regulation actually affect the ideas that we receive through the media and even the way that we think every day because of that. But this is our opportunity to explore the connections between regulation, lawmaking, and how our media works. And I hope that you will all be part of this conversation as well. The way it works is each speaker will speak for 15 or 20 minutes after Professor Glasser gives us a bit of an introduction. And we'll hold questions till the end. We'll have a 20-minute conversation at the end, and I'll have my microphone, and you can ask questions, and it'll be great. So, without further adu, these are our distinguished speakers here. We have, of course, Ted Glasser, who's moderating this yet again, who is our very esteemed journalism expert, who, well, I don't really need to introduce him to you guys. Victor Pickard, to Ted's right, is Assistant Professor of Communication at Penn, at the Annenberg School. He studies the intersection of media activism and politics, and he studies the history and political economy of media institutions. And he's going to help us understand how decisions in the past by the FCC still affect us today, and maybe give us some inspiration for what needs to happen today. He has previously taught at NYU. He was a senior research fellow at Free Press and at the New America Foundation. He's worked in policy, and we're just delighted to have him, so thank you. To Victor's right is FCC Commissioner Mignon Clyburn, who has served on the FCC for 5 years now, and is just starting her second term, I believe. Before that, she worked for 11 years on the Public Service Commission of South Carolina, and she has a journalism background, which we're all proud and excited to hear about. She was co-owner and operator of the Coastal Times, which is a family-founded Charleston weekly newspaper that focuses on issues affecting the African-American community. And then our final speaker is Morgan Weiland. She's getting her PhD in communication, but she's also finishing up her JD here at the law school. And she's a student fellow at Stanford Center for Internet and Society. She's on law review, so I don't know how she has the time to be here. She's also on the Supreme Court Litigation Clinic, and her work focuses on the intersection of the First Amendment, networked media, and technology. So we're just really delighted to have everyone. Ted?
Thanks. First, a very warm and hearty congratulations to Chris for producing yet again a wonderful program under the auspices of the Rebele. First Amendment Symposium series. Since this is a series devoted to the First Amendment, I thought it might be appropriate to spend a couple of minutes framing this as a First Amendment set of issues. And in particular, what I want to do is talk about competing interpretations of the First Amendment, arguing in effect that there is a dominant prevailing interpretation of the First Amendment that is not very compatible with ideas of reform, but that there are other interpretations, opposing interpretations of the First Amendment that are much more amenable to questions of reform. So I want to outline for you those competing visions of the First Amendment, and I'm doing this in a highly stylized way, which is to say crude and unsophisticated, and overstated, but for purposes of making the point that there are very different ways of looking at the First Amendment, particularly if we have questions of reform in mind. The dominant interpretation of the First Amendment is a very libertarian one. It's what Lee Bollinger at Columbia University calls the central image of a free press. It's a vision of the First Amendment that emphasizes individual liberty and private autonomy. It's rooted in the idea of negative freedom, where we talk about freedom from. Freedom from what? Freedom from the state. Freedom from coercion. Freedom from a coercive state. That is the dominant prevailing model of the free press and the dominant interpretation of the First Amendment, and I think helps us understand why it's so difficult in American journalism today, and it's been this way for decades, so difficult to raise questions of responsibility and accountability. That the extreme libertarian interpretation of the First Amendment means that a free press is genuinely free to be irresponsible. In fact, that's almost a direct quote from a former editor of the Wall Street Journal. Well, I want to compare that or contrast that to a very different understanding of the First Amendment, one that embraces the idea of positive freedom, where freedom is understood as incorporating, encompassing negative freedom, but going beyond it. So it's not simply freedom from, but freedom from the state for something else, and that for something else is the ideal of popular sovereignty. That we have a free press, not because we need a free press. Free press is not an end in itself. We need a free press in order to be able to govern ourselves. It's a very different understanding of freedom, because there we can begin to talk about the standards of responsibility, the standards of performance and practice that we can hold the press accountable to. In the first interpretation, and then for simple reasons, we'll call this Interpretation 1 and Interpretation 2. Not conceptually provocative language, but you get the point. Interpretation 1, the libertarian, the dominant interpretation, focuses on self-expression. There's nothing more important than protecting the right of speakers. Interpretation number 2 shifts the focus from self-expression to self-governance. There's less focus on the individual, less focus on speakers, more interest in speech. In other words, it's the distinction, it's the difference between protecting individual expression and protecting the content of expression. The negative view of freedom focuses on protecting individual expression, whereas the positive view, the affirmative view of the First Amendment, right, shifts to focusing on protecting the content. And probably the most articulate exponent of this point of view, one of my favorite First Amendment scholars, Alexander Mignon, has been quoted frequently as saying, the First Amendment was never intended to protect unregulated talkativeness. The point of the First Amendment isn't to make sure that you say what you want to say. What's important is that we get to hear what we need to hear, that what's worth saying gets said. Now, every once in a while, we will shift from one interpretation to another, but not often enough. Probably the most famous example was the Supreme Court case in 1969 involving a radio station and the Supreme Court's consideration of the FCC's fairness doctrine, where the FCC advocated fairness, right, a judgment beyond the marketplace, right, and the Supreme Court upheld it with a startling pronouncement that it's the listener's right to hear that's paramount, as opposed to the broadcaster's right to be heard. And that's probably the most dramatic example of the FCC and the Supreme Court embracing a positive or affirmative interpretation of the First Amendment. But it's an anomaly. Right, a few years later, the Supreme Court returned to a similar set of circumstances involving a newspaper and a right of reply law in the state of Florida, and said, in effect, just the opposite, that it's the publisher's right to be heard. There is no right to read, right to hear. And how did they reconcile that with Red Lion? Didn't even try. If I remember correctly, Red Lion wasn't even cited in the Tornillo case. Under the first interpretation, the libertarian interpretation, freedom of the press is understood as a private privilege, as opposed to the positive interpretation where freedom of the press is understood as a public right. A.J. Liebling wasn't kidding when he said freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one. In the first interpretation, there is no accountability beyond the marketplace, and the marketplace provides a bad opportunity for accountability to the extent that the marketplace operates without standards. The marketplace operates purely on a Darwinian basis. Whatever survives is by virtue of its survival. Good, true, beautiful, whatever the description might be. There are no objective, independent standards of quality in the marketplace. The affirmative view, the positive view, the second interpretation of the First Amendment, moves from the marketplace to the public sphere, where we can have a public debate, where we can come together collectively and decide on the standards of performance and practice. So if we're serious then about questions of reform, if we're serious about bringing about the conditions for more and better media, more and better journalism, then I think we need to move beyond the first interpretation of the First Amendment and move closer to the second interpretation of the First Amendment. And that may involve questions that journalists are seldom eager to ask. And those questions involve whether or not there's a role for the state to play in creating the conditions for more and better public communication. The state, in the first interpretation of the First Amendment, the state is seen as the enemy. In the second interpretation, the state is often seen as a partner. Now, don't confuse this with advocating state control and ownership of communication. That's not the point. Rather, the state playing a role in creating the conditions for the quality of communication that the marketplace won't provide, but we think we want. That the state does not need to be the enemy of the First Amendment. We too often forget that the First Amendment was in fact created by the state. Thank you.
This works here. Okay. Thank you, Ted, for those remarks. Oh. Thank you, Ted, for those remarks. I will be, I couldn't agree more, and I will be reiterating many of the similar points in a less eloquent fashion. First, I'd also like to thank the Rebeles and Chris and Mark and everyone who helped organize this event. And thank you all for coming out today. It's such a delight for me to be here. I'll be discussing materials that are coming out of my recently published book. Here it is. And this book is a historical project. It was meant to be a history of the present, hopefully a usable history. I could not have anticipated how timely the net neutrality debate would be for the publication of my book. So I'm very appreciative, not only that because the FCC passed very strong and meaningful net neutrality protections, but also they were considerate enough to time it with the publication of my book. It's been very convenient. I won't be talking about net neutrality, but I think you'll hear a number of historical parallels in the narrative that I'm going to present today. And I think history is very important to remind us that much of what we consider to be commonsensical, natural, inevitable today was actually the direct effect of earlier conflicts when certain interests, certain logics, certain value systems prevailed over others. And it reminds us that history is contingent, that there were other roads not taken. And it shows us that we could have and could still have a different kind of media system. So I think any sort of reformist project needs to have a sense of this longer history. So my work, this book and my ongoing work begins with one big question, which is, how did we in the United States come to inherit a particular kind of media system? A system that in many sectors is dominated by a handful of corporations, a system that is only lightly regulated in terms of public interest protections, and a system that is predominantly commercial with only relatively weak public alternatives. Taken together, this is a fairly unique situation among democratic societies. So I wanted to get at the historical and the ideological roots of this American exceptionalism. And as I explored this question, as I dug deeper into the archives, it seemed that at least part of the answer could be traced back to a cluster of policy battles in the 1940s when reformers, media industries, and government grappled over key questions about the role of media in a democratic society. Now, to focus on the 40s instead of the political hotspots of the 30s and the 60s, this might seem a little bit counterintuitive. It's almost like 40s and 50s are treated like flyover country by a lot of historians, aside for minor events like World War II. But I would argue that in the United States, especially for media institutions, this was a moment, this was a critical juncture when, for example, you saw the newspaper industry having a structural crisis with some parallels to the one that we're facing today. You saw a lot of technological change, the rise of FM radio, television right around the corner, a politically turbulent moment as well, even though the more radical edge of the New Deal project was in retreat at this time in the 40s, social movements were still expanding. It was almost like activists hadn't received the memo that the window of reform was closing, and you actually saw a spike of various kinds of media activism, or various kinds of activism in general, especially connected to the civil rights movement and the labor movement. So the 40s also witnessed a surge in public discontent toward media institutions, especially commercial radio. Much of the criticism at this time probably sounds familiar to us today. There were concerns about excessive commercialism, misrepresentations of marginalized people and ideas, lack of minority-owned media concentration, loss of local programming, a purge of liberal commentators. Anyone remotely left of center were being removed from the airwaves. There was also concern about just overall poor quality. Even though soap operas were hugely popular at this time, many people also wanted to hear something different, find other voices, other stories on the air. But the biggest critique that stood out this time was about radio advertising, the incessant and invasive radio advertising. There were terms of derision that people used. They called them plug uglies and singing jingles. There were actually national campaigns to drive the plug uglies from the air. There was a plug shrinkers club in New York City. Fortune magazine referred to this outpouring of criticism as the revolt against radio, and there was a general sense that this still new medium was not living up to its democratic potential. Many of the more utopian things that we still hear today about the internet, how it's going to revolutionize the way that we govern ourselves, talk about important issues. Similar things were being said about the radio in the 30s and 40s. But by the mid-40s, there was a kind of reckoning that radio was not living up to its democratic potential, and this was largely because of commercial capture, that commercial interests had taken it over. I think representing this sentiment perhaps the best was from a letter sent to the National Association of Broadcasters by Lee DeForest, who's considered the father of radio. He invented this thing called the odd-iron tube. And he wrote, "What have you gentlemen done with my child? He was conceived as a potent instrumentality for culture, fine music, the uplifting of America's mass intelligence. You've debased the child to collect money from all and sundry. You've made him a laughingstock of intelligence. Soap opera without end or sense floods each household daily. The curse of commercials has grown consistently more cursed year by year." By the way, this was republished in the New York Times, Time Magazine, all over the place. It was clearly resonating with this growing critique. I should note that beyond intellectuals and activist groups, the voices that stand out the most in the materials that I consulted, especially the weeks that I spent at the FCC, the National Archives, where the FCC papers are held, are letters from average listeners to the FCC, just hundreds and thousands of letters, bulging folders, many people upset about their radio. And I don't think they necessarily represented the majority of listeners at this time, but certainly a significant minority. And of course, this was the golden age, the golden era of radio. So I'm trying to recover some of this descent. And I have a couple examples that I'll share with you, admittedly more dramatic examples, but I think they're representative. One woman announced that she was starting a letter-writing campaign for the aged, the sick in homes and hospitals, the housewives who do not like these banal programs. She asked the FCC, please keep up the fight. If it means government control, better that than advertiser control. Another powerful letter came from an African-American World War II veteran who, upon his return to the States, was appalled by the racist radio programming that he was hearing, especially popular shows like Amos and Andy. Here, if you'll indulge me, historians like to show off their primary materials. I'll just do it this once, or maybe one other time. But you can't read this. I'll just read a quote. It's a really powerful piece. He wrote the FCC that, quote, after defeating the devils of fascism, discrimination, hate, prejudice, and Jim Crow, we've come home to find these same enemies are very much alive here on the radio. This is not the democratic way of life for which so many of our fallen comrades paid so dearly with their lives. This is the Hitler pattern. This is American fascism. So very powerful. Again, I may have chosen the most dramatic letters, but I think it gets across some of these recurring critiques. But listeners were not just passive. They weren't just throwing things at their radio sets. Some of them were quite active. They were involved in various kinds of media activism at this time. There were petitions, call-ins, letter-writing campaigns. A signature model of 1940s radio activism was what was called the community or neighborhood listener council. This is usually formed of parents, educators, minority groups who would essentially get together and do content analysis of their local programming, and then armed with this data, they would try to pressure local broadcasters in the FCC to include more local programming and, again, to cut down on the excessive commercialism. Activist groups were also creating their own alternative media. Many African-American newspapers were being launched at this time. Labor unions were successful in buying a few radio stations. You also had Pacifica Radio. Some of you are probably familiar with that. This is a model that came out in the 1940s based on listener support, nonprofit, non-commercial. And then there was also this proliferation of activist pamphlets. This is my one other time where I'm showing you primary sources with titles like the Radio Handbook, Radio is Yours. In fact, I have a sample here from Radio is Yours. Again, using quantitative analysis to empirically show that soap operas are dominating the airwaves to the detriment of other types of programming like public affairs coverage. In this other booklet I have here, the Radio Handbook, it instructed labor groups on how to get on the air and produce their own shows. And it reminded activists that although broadcasters own the radio station's equipment, quote, the air over which the broadcasts are made does not belong to corporations. The air belongs to the people. And this phrase, this slogan, the air belongs to the people, was kind of a rallying cry for a media reform movement that was emerging in the 1940s. Because despite all these forms of media activism, many activist groups came to the realization that they still depended on a commercial media system, a system that was often hostile to their views. And they realized that regardless of what their main issue was, to advance their politics, they would have to change the media system, and to do that, they'd have to change media policy. So you saw a media reform movement rise up composed of civil rights groups, religious organizations, educators, labor unions, and other progressive activists, and their interests would converge around specific policy interventions. And this activism coincided with the progressive bloc at the FCC. It hasn't happened too often in our history, but we saw at this time there were 7 commissioners instead of the 5 that you have today. 4 of the 7 were reliable progressives. And the New Deal, I mentioned that it was in retreat throughout much of government at this time, but it arrived later and stayed longer at the FCC, where it was kind of having its last stand. And it arrived with this gentleman here, James Lawrence Fly, better known as Larry Fly. Maybe it's a cigarette holder. It looks a little bit like Hunter S. Thompson here. But He's not a household name today, but in the 40s, he struck fear in the heart of commercial broadcasters. He was known as this anti-monopolist crusader, tough liberal from Texas, which isn't a phrase we hear too often anymore. I should say that he wasn't just a lone ranger. He also was backed by, of course, social movements at this time. There was another Southerner, Clifford Durr from Alabama. He was involved in these reform efforts. And there was also the first chief economist. Some of you may have heard of him, Dallas Smythe. He was kind of behind the scenes doing a lot of the data analysis. He later went on to found the critical political economy school of media studies in the United States. I think of him as kind of like my grandfather in terms of intellectual lineage. But Larry Fly came to the FCC with this anti-monopoly agenda, and to give you a sense of how he really felt about commercial broadcasting. And again, this was much to the broadcaster's chagrin, reprinted in various outlets. He said that commercial broadcasting is, quote, like a dead mackerel in the moonlight. It both shines and stinks. And commercial broadcasters weren't very pleased with that, and he definitely didn't get off to a good start with them. So during this time, with this grassroots from below and these progressive policy elites from above, it created this fleeting window where progressive, even radical reforms were possible, things that would be unthinkable during less contentious times. And just to give you, here's a sort of a laundry list. I won't have time to talk about all of these. And not all of these took place at the FCC, I should be clear about that. But it included the 1943 where they forced NBC to divest itself of one of its two major networks. The 45 Supreme Court ruling, this was going back to Ted's example of the 69 Red Lion case. I think the 45 decision is another one of these high watermarks of articulating positive freedoms, a positive interpretation of the First Amendment. You had the 1946 FCC Blue Book report, which I'll be talking about a little bit more in a moment, the 47 Hutchins Commission report, which established journalistic ethics, and what later became known as the Fairness Doctrine was passed in 1949. The logic driving these reform efforts can best be described as social democratic in the sense that it assumed a progressive role for the state in protecting media's public service responsibilities from excessive commercialism. And this logic also assumed that a mixed system, a structurally diverse system, was preferable to one that was entirely reliant on the market. It assumed that our rights, the public's rights, were at least as important as the rights of media corporations. So just discussing a couple of these, I'll begin with the 43 intervention, because that was quite dramatic. When Larry Fly first got to the FCC, he took this languishing report, which had been this sort of innocuous study of the state of American broadcasting, and turned it into what later became known as the Monopoly Report. It was this aggressive study into the lack of competition in local radio markets, and he used the findings from this report to essentially trust bust NBC. He passed new rules at the FCC that forced NBC to break itself into two, divest itself of one of its two major networks, which is actually how we got ABC. So this was quite a dramatic intervention, pretty unthinkable for us today, but this is what they were doing at the FCC in the 1940s, and yet it probably doesn't surprise you that going from two big players to three did not transform, so adding ABC to NBC and CBS did not democratize the media system. So they switched strategies and started looking at licensing rules, how broadcasters would hold on to their monopolistic access to the public airwaves. And this is what was called, it came in a blue cover, so it was called the FCC Blue Book. A year-long study was authored by this gentleman, Charles Seatman, who was a British-born but American naturalized citizen. He was actually one of the first programming directors at the BBC. So this became quite significant later on. And they found that broadcasters aired soap operas in advertising instead of public affairs programming. You could probably, this is a content analysis, you could probably figure out which one is the sponsored content and which one is the sort of public affairs, non-commercial content. Definitely they were finding that predominantly the programming was being sponsored by things like soap companies, which of course is how we get the term soap operas. So to try to remedy this, they passed a number of criteria. The broadcasters had to cover experimental programs, promote live programs, devote programs to local public affairs, and eliminate excessive advertising. That's probably the point that freaked out broadcasters the most, because that's, of course, hitting their bottom line. So I won't leave you in suspense. This wasn't a successful effort, but they certainly tried, and had they been successful, I think we'd have a very different broadcasting system, a very different media system in the United States today. But the moment that the Blue Book came out, you had an industry counterattack, which alleged that the FCC was attacking free radio, that Charles Siepman, the main author of the report, was in league with communist infiltrators. I always trip over this, but they accused the FCC of BBC-izing American radio. This is like the worst thing that they could do. So a lot of red baiting. I go into this in great depth in my book, because I think red baiting played such an important role in how our media system developed. I don't think as a society we've really come to terms with this lasting legacy. But to make a very long and sad story short, the last of the New Dealers were chased out of Washington, D.C. Many of them fled to where radicals often go, fled to the academy. Some of them, like Clifford Durr, was later involved in the civil rights movement. He actually was involved with Rosa Parks' historic bus ride. He helped organize that. He and his wife, Virginia, helped bail her out of jail, represent her in court. So that's a happier ending to what was really kind of tragic. A lot of people's, their careers were ruined, and pretty much the progressive agenda was derailed. There was one last battle around the Fairness Doctrine in 1949, but there's a bit of historical irony there. Today it's held up as this high watermark, at least among progressives. Conservatives would say the exact opposite, but it's held up as like a sign of enlightened media policy. If we just had the Fairness Doctrine, then we could balance out Fox News, Rush Limbaugh. But in fact, ironically, at the time, it was seen as a weak derivative to stronger structural regulations. So this came out as what I refer to as a post-war settlement, that media would remain self-regulated, practice largely industry-defined social responsibility, and protected by a negative First Amendment. And here I'm repeating what Ted said earlier. Together, this created a new social contract that continues to shape much of the media that we still interact with today. It also gets at, and I've run out of time, so I'm only going to mention one of these. It's in the subtitle of my book, Corporate Libertarianism, which is this ideological formation that came out of the 40s that attaches individual freedoms to corporate entities, especially connected to the First Amendment. And it often elevates these rights over the rights of other groups, local communities, and society writ large. It also assumes that government has little legitimate role in intervening in media markets. And I think you could say this logic's even more pronounced today. To give one example, Verizon, in their arguments to the DC Circuit Court, said that net neutrality was a violation of their First Amendment rights. I think this logic, we're only going to see, the court actually sidestepped this argument, didn't really address it head on, but I think we'll be hearing more of this argument in the months and years to come. But to end on a happy note, I want to say that I think one of the key lessons that comes out of this 1940s history is it shows that when the public engages with these policy debates, it can really drive, it can shape and even drive how these policies, these debates unfold. And I think that's exactly what we saw today with the net neutrality debate, and I think we can continue to see that as long as the public remains engaged. So on that cheerful note, I will end. Thank you very much.
What a perfect segue. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, so I'm from the Deep South, meaning South Carolina, not Southern California, so we're going to try this again. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I wish to join the others in thanking the Department of Communications, Professor Larson. What an incredible setup for us. Thank you, appreciate it. And the support, of course, of Christine Larson. You are remarkable. And I could not, especially with that last name being from the South. Rebele? That's it. I love it. That's how I say it anyway. Southerners take a lot of liberties. But it's thank you so much for this 6th symposium, allowing this free exchange of ideas. I really appreciate the opportunity to visit this campus when I was not sneaking on at night, and being pretty sad because I wanted my niece to come here. Please help me continue to work on it. We have a video memorialized on that. Well, we'll still keep working on it. I've got a feeling I'm going to lose her to the deeper South, but we'll work on that. I wanted you to know, those who don't know me well, that I spent 14 years running a small weekly newspaper in Charleston, South Carolina. And with that background and my subsequent role as a communications regulator, the importance of free speech truly resonates with me. I thought free speech and maybe not free expression in terms of, let's see. So now I need help in, hopefully that's my next one. I might have gone to the end. Hold on. So, yes. So we'll continue to, sorry about that, guys. Apparently you can't get certain people. Hold on. So, all right. So we're back. So forgive that. I would like to focus this afternoon's remarks on the FCC's recent open internet decision, not only because it's the hot topic of the day, the week, the month, the year, and one that I am sure all of you are most interested in, but also because it is directly relevant to this year's symposium. For the reasons I will discuss, I strongly believe that this decision will promote free expression as well as diversity and innovation on the internet. I will begin by explaining what we mean when we say an open internet, how the FCC's recent decisions promote the goals of an open internet, and what our latest decision actually does and does not do. The idea of an open internet refers to the FCC's longstanding commitment to protect and promote a platform that nurtures freedom of speech and expression, supports innovation in commerce, and creates incentives for investment. When discussing this topic, it is important to keep the FCC's recent actions in perspective. The decision we reached a few weeks ago was just the latest chapter in a long series of efforts to preserve an open internet. While our most recent decision has been labeled as unprecedented, the FCC has had open internet policies in place for more than a decade. Remember in 2004, when former FCC Chairman Michael Powell announced his vision that broadband consumers should be entitled to certain internet freedoms. 1 year later, the FCC unanimously approved the Internet Policy Statement, which laid out 4 guiding principles designed to encourage broadband deployment and preserve and promote the open and interconnected nature of the Internet. These principles sought to ensure that consumers had the right to access and use the lawful online content, applications, and devices of their choice, and to do so in a competitive internet ecosystem. From 2005 to 2010, the FCC incorporated the principles in the Internet Policy Statement into a number of decisions, including as conditions on several merger approvals. In 2008, the FCC found that Comcast had violated the Internet Policy Statement by blocking so-called peer-to-peer connections. While the FCC has long been working to preserve internet freedoms, we have hit some legal roadblocks. In 2010, an appellate court found that the FCC lacked authority to hold Comcast accountable for violations of the Internet Policy Statement. In response, The FCC adopted new open internet rules later that year and codified policy principles contained in the Internet Policy Statement. That order adopted 3 clear rules of the road: no blocking, no unreasonable discrimination, and transparency. The no blocking rule and no unreasonable discrimination rules prevented broadband service providers from deliberately interfering with consumers' access to lawful content, applications, and services. The transparency rule promoted informed consumer choice by requiring internet service providers to disclose certain information. Although I was concerned that we should have relied on stronger legal authority for these rules, I strongly supported this decision and the goals it sought to achieve. Then in 2014, a court of appeals struck down the 2010 rules with the exception of the transparency rule. Although the court agreed with the policy objectives underlying the rules, they disagreed with the legal authority the FCC used. The decision the FCC made a few weeks ago was in response to the latest rejection from that court. We adopted bright line rules to ensure that Americans reap the economic, social, and civic benefits of an open internet today and into the future. Specifically, we adopted a no blocking rule, which means that broadband providers may not block access to legal content, applications, services, or non-harmful devices. We adopted a ban on throttling so that broadband providers may not block or impair a website or an application because it competes against their service. We also ruled that there may be no paid prioritization. Broadband providers may not favor some lawful internet traffic over other lawful traffic in exchange for money or consideration of any kind. In other words, no fast lanes. We put in place a general conduct rule, which states that broadband providers may not unreasonably interfere or disadvantage the ability of consumers to reach websites of their choice. The notion of this type of general conduct standard is not new. In fact, it is similar to the ban on unreasonable discrimination that we adopted in 2010. This rule is designed to ensure that we have the tools to address future conduct. Because the internet is always growing and changing, there must be a known standard by which to address concerns that arise with new practices. Finally, we enhanced the transparency requirements that remained in place from the FCC's 2010 Open Internet rules. The new rules reflect mobile parity. For the first time, our rules will apply in the same way to fixed and mobile internet providers. This part of the decision was important to me because I believe that users of mobile devices should be subject to the same protections as other users. We know that the majority of low-income Americans, really the majority of most Americans, rely heavily on their mobile device, and for some, that mobile device is their only access to the internet. They deserve a robust experience on par with their wired peers, and they should not be relegated to a second-class internet. It bears emphasis that these rules apply only to broadband internet service providers, or ISPs, because you know we like acronyms, as the providers of broadband services. They do not apply to websites, applications, or others who rely on ISPs to reach the content of consumers of their choice. The rules ensure that consumers decide which websites are accessed, not the internet service providers. In addition to adopting new rules in our latest decision, we also reclassified internet access service as a telecommunications service. This has been a hot-button topic in the media and is often couched in headlines stating that the FCC has made the internet into a public utility. But what does this really mean? Previously, broadband internet access services, which were labeled information services under our old rules, and the decision to reclassify broadband services as a telecommunications service was basically a factual one. Broadband internet access service is a means of transmission for consumers to access content, applications, and the services of their choosing. Reclassification also enables each of us to adopt stronger open internet rules than we were able to do in the past. But the idea of classifying broadband service as a telecommunications service, again, is not new. It is something that the FCC has considered for a number of years and an approach that I consistently supported since 2010. So how would the FCC's decision impact what we can say and how we can say it? In my opinion, the framework of the Open Internet Order will ensure that the Internet continues to embody the values at the very core of our First Amendment. As most of you in this audience surely know, the United States adopted the Bill of Rights in 1791. The framers recognized that basic freedoms enshrined in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were fundamental to a free and open democratic society. James Madison gave life to the First Amendment in a scant 45 words, which are central to the spirit of this great nation. Almost 2 centuries later, Justice William Brennan would write in the historic 1964 New York Times versus Sullivan decision that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. The Internet embodies the rigorous, robust, and unfettered debate that President Madison and Justice Brennan idealized. It has transformed the ability of all of us, from well-established news organizations to independent bloggers, to entrepreneurial content creators, to ordinary citizens around this country, to make our thoughts and our opinions known to the world. One example from my very own experience that illustrates this transformative power of the Internet was a public input that was mentioned that we received as we were considering these open Internet rules. As we do whenever we consider new rules at the FCC, we invited the public to comment. And because of both the importance of the subject matter and the ease of providing input via the Internet, people responded in unprecedented numbers. Nearly 4 million Americans, from all perspectives and walks of life, exercised their right to comment on our proposed rules. This marked the first time that many had participated in a government proceeding and the first time that the FCC had the opportunity to listen to and consider so many opinions. The ability of these individuals to have a direct conversation with their government highlights not only the importance of a free and open Internet, but the power such openness has to encourage civic engagement. As one of our greatest civil rights pioneers, Representative John Lewis of Georgia, has stated so eloquently, if we had the Internet during the civil rights movement, we could have done more, much more, to bring people together from all around the country to organize and work together to build the beloved community. That is why it's so important for us to protect the Internet. Every voice matters, and we cannot let the interests of profit silence the voices of those pursuing human dignity. I also believe that the rules we codified will help ensure that the Internet remains the greatest equalizer of our time. It does not matter who you are, how much money you have, or where you are from. Gender, sex, demographics do not determine if that new app will be successful or not. This has broken down traditional barriers, allowing good ideas to compete on equal terms with those with deep pockets. It allows consumers to determine which ideas become successful. A story of a woman I met recently has underscored the importance of the Internet and the power of a good idea. Some of you may have heard of a young African-American writer named Issa Rae. Ms. Ray came to my office before we made the decision and shared with me how an open and free internet has changed her life. She had this idea, you see, for a new television series, but was repeatedly told no by the usual gatekeepers because they concluded that there was no audience interested in her content. But she knew she had a great idea. She persevered. She produced her own content, posted it on YouTube, and millions of viewers later, she proved those naysayers wrong. Today, I am happy to say she is developing her own pilot on HBO. So some of the decision's most fiercest critic would say to you today that the internet is not and was not broken, and therefore we did not need to fix it. The premise of these arguments, I say, are shaky at best. The openness, innovation, and investment we have seen in this country did not happen organically. The truth, for those willing to admit it, is that our policies have in fact been key enablers for the incredibly vibrant and accessible internet ecosystem we are so fortunate to have today. And what is obvious but too seldom said is that the very same policies and rules which have been in place for nearly a decade are directly responsible for the current environment we enjoy, have proven their effectiveness, and have struck the right balance. So to those who say we should have just left everything alone, I issue a word of caution. The environment we enjoy today is not absolute and should never, ever be taken for granted. Just take a casual look around the world. We are witnessing governments blocking access to websites, including social media. Remember last year when Turkey blocked Twitter and other social media? There are reports that the government of Egypt has considered building a system to spy on Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp, among others. And in China, where 20% of the current internet users live, the government employs an estimated 2 million sensors to police the internet and their users. And these and many other countries around the globe, it is routine for governments to determine the types of websites and content that can be accessed by their citizens, but I am proud to say that the United States is not among them. But absent clear and concrete open internet rules, any internet service provider would possess the power to limit free expression. Without the rules we put in place, any internet service provider would be free to block, throttle, favor, or discriminate against traffic, or exact tolls from any user for any reason or for no reason at all. This is more than a theoretical exercise. Providers right here in the United States have, in fact, blocked applications on mobile devices, which not only hampers free expression, but restricts competition and innovation by allowing the companies that control the pipelines and airwaves, not the content creator or consumers, to pick winners and losers. And to me, the very essence of the open internet debate is this: how do we ensure that there continues to be only one internet where all applications, products, ideas, and diverse points of view have the same chance of being seen and heard? This question, and this question only, was my compass as I evaluated our latest decision, and I believe the outcome reflects this fundamental goal. So thank you again for inviting me to speak at this event. It has been my pleasure to appear before you, and at the appropriate time, I would be glad to entertain any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First, I'll say thank you to Professor Glasser, my advisor, so I must say thank you to him for his opening remarks. Thank you to the Rebeles, who have hosted many events, and I've attended many, and this one is hopefully as good as the others. I'll do my best to live up to the great the great work that Chris has done in past years. Thank you so much to Chris. It's a pleasure to be here, and to Jay as well for helping to organize. So thank you all for taking some of your time this afternoon. I'm going to turn our attention away from the FCC and certain institutions and legal branches in our government and toward the Supreme Court. And so Commissioner Clyburn's discussion of New York Times versus Sullivan and Professor Glasser's introduction about Supreme Court jurisprudence, some First Amendment cases, Red Lion and Miami Herald, sets us up nicely for what I'll be talking about. Two questions really animated my research here. Why do courts and lawmakers think of the press as an institution? And why does that matter? Today, I'll argue that the Supreme Court developed its understanding of the press as an institution at the very moment when the press itself was becoming an institution, and in the same terms in which the press was defining itself. This argument is rooted in an historical look at how the press became an institution and how the court changed its understanding of the press over time. I'll focus much of this talk on themes that I found when reading every press case that the court handed down before 1940. Perhaps most importantly, I'll explain that the court made a key analytical move of applying what it understood as an individual right to the freedom of the press and transformed it into an institutional right. Indeed, this insight could contribute to First Amendment scholarship more broadly about the transformation of individual rights to institutional or corporate rights, especially in the campaign finance context. Finally, I'll address the so what question. Why does this insight matter? I'll talk about why the insight that the court's understanding of the press clause as socially constructed and historically contingent matters for current policy debates. Specifically, I'll discuss how lawmakers took for granted that the press necessarily is an institution when drafting and debating the most recent iteration of the federal shield legislation. Indeed, the way they developed those the bills, the language that they used, threatened to exclude certain types of journalists and ossify an outdated institutional definition of the press at the very moment that the press itself is changing. So I'll begin by providing some evidence that the press developed as an institution at the turn of the 20th century. Before I go any further, a quick definition. I use this term a lot throughout the presentation, so it's important to understand what I mean when I talk about the institutional press. When I use the term institutional press, I'm referring to the American press as it developed as a professional institution, as it developed specifically professional identity, norms, codes, and practices that distinguished it from other groups. Many journalism and communication scholars agree that this happened in the aftermath of World War I. We can see why this is true when we look at the rise in professionalism as a proxy for institutionalism. There are two key aspects of professionalism that matter here: professional norms that developed at this time and professional practices. The most important professional norm that developed after World War I is the norm of objectivity. Michael Schudson, journalism and communication scholar, described the rise of the norm of objectivity in his seminal book, Discovering the News, and explained that the twin rise of public relations and wartime propaganda engendered a massive amount of skepticism in journalists. They saw that public relations professionals were developing as a distinct entity, and they wanted to define themselves as separate and distinct from PR professionals. And at the same time, they were jaded because they had been used as part of wartime propaganda movements in World War I and wanted to set themselves apart as adversarial to the government. And so, as Schudson explains, objectivity essentially served as an antidote to skepticism and became the dominant norm around which the profession organized itself. Second, there was a variety of different professional practices that emerged after World War I. Journalism schools really came into their own at this time. Professional organizations developed, and ethical codes were promulgated by these organizations. So, two key professional organizations developed around this time: the Society of Professional Journalists in 1909 and the American Society of Newspaper Editors in 1922. Both of these organizations are still in existence today. Most importantly, perhaps, these organizations promulgated ethical codes in which they self-reflected and defined what they thought of themselves as journalists, what was their role in fulfilling their responsibility in American democracy. So if we look, sort of like Victor's presentation, I also like to look at historical documents. If we go back and look at the American Society of Newspaper Editors Ethical Code, we can see two very important norms articulated in this code of ethics. So these are two functions that the press saw itself playing. The first is the educative or informative function. So in the preamble to the code here, we see that AS&E is describing the press as having opportunities as a chronicler which are indissolubly linked to its obligations as a teacher and interpreter. Second, AS&E, in two of the canons of the Code of Ethics that it has, it describes what we've come to know as the checking or watchdog role. And it does this by saying that independence is being free from all obligation except to fidelity to the public interest. And then in the second canon, the freedom of the press, it defines that as the opportunity, as the unquestionable right to discuss whatever is not explicitly forbidden by law, including the wisdom of any restrictive statute. So this definition effectively operationalizes responsibility to the public and absolute adversarial posture vis-a-vis the government, which we've come to know as the checking or watchdog role. At the very moment when the press was becoming an institution in the terms that I've just described, so too did the Supreme Court develop an image of the press in the same terms, articulating a vision of the press as institution in its 20th century cases. This conclusion is supported by my reading of every Supreme Court case about the press clause or the freedom of the press prior to 1940. This is a meaningful methodological choice because in order to look at change over time, you really have to look at the arc of all of these cases. And I chose 1940 as a cutoff date because it provides enough time after the press actually became an institution to look at those sorts of cases that would have come before the court. My findings are essentially embodied in three different trends. Because I only have 20 minutes, and I don't want to anger Chris, I won't go into every single case that I read. I'll only provide some highlights by picking emblematic cases and really diving into one or two of those when I talk about each of the different themes. So first, the early cases, before World War I. Interestingly, the court was largely silent about the press clause at this time, and the cases that I read didn't coalesce in a clear image of the press. There are a few cases that do have some sort of an image, and I like to call these cases the Postal Service cases. In the late 19th century, there were about 3 cases in which the Supreme Court evaluated the constitutionality of statutes that provided for the regulation of materials sent through the Postal Service. In these cases, as in Ex parte Jackson, the court defined the freedom of the press as the twin liberty of circulating and of publishing. Interestingly, though, the court never really defined what it meant by press, or the press clause. There are some clues, though. The court referred to newspapers and pamphlets at this time, suggesting that that might be what it had in mind when it referred to the press. Still, there really are very few other cases at this time, and of the cases that do exist, they're actually in tension with this definition. There are about 2 cases in which the court actually takes up a fact pattern about publication and circulation, but considers those cases as speech cases and not press cases. In the second era, the World War I era, roughly 1920 to 1930, the court moved away from its prior view. There were many cases at this time that took up the Espionage Act, which really dominated the cases in this era, which was about the criminalization of publication and circulation of leaflets and newspapers, much like the one shown in the image on the left, which was the publication that was at issue in a very well-known case called Schneck, which developed the clear and present danger test. So, interestingly, the Supreme Court largely did not decide these cases as press cases, but rather as speech cases. And when it did discuss the press clause, it was always in conjunction with the speech clause. As you can see in the cartoon on the right-hand side, and sort of similar to what Victor was talking about, the first Red Scare, the one after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, was really animating what was going on at the time. You can see that, I think it's clear from where you're sitting, but the Bolshevik is pulling capitalism down into chaos. Simply at this time, the radical communist and socialist presses were not considered protected either as part of an institutional vision of the press or an individual vision of the press. This narrowed image of press freedom resulted in incredibly strongly worded dissents that sounded the alarm about threats to press freedom, as we'll see in the case that we'll review. In a case called Schaefer, newspapermen were indicted under the Espionage Act for, quote, knowingly, willfully, and unlawfully causing to be printed, published, and circulated in and through one or other of those newspapers' false reports and statements, or otherwise violating the Espionage Act. The facts in this case had to do with publication and circulation. As we recall in the Postal Service cases, publication and circulation were the key elements of the freedom of the press. But again, this case was considered as a speech clause case, not a press clause case. Justice Brandeis, in dissent, sounded the alarm about this. He wrote, "To hold that such publications can be suppressed as false reports subjects to new perils the constitutional liberty of the press." And indeed, the majority so strongly disagreed with him that they quoted him and then responded that, quote, "If there be such practice, this case is not concerned with it." The majority did not see this as a press issue. Everything changed after World War I. The post-World War I moment was an inflection point, both for the press and for the court. At that moment, the press emerged as an institution. For the court, its press jurisprudence took on a fundamentally new and fundamentally different character. The court began to see press freedoms not just as individual, but moreover as institutional, and to take up the watchdogging and informative functions of the press that the press was articulating about itself. As with most changes, it wasn't immediate or direct, and I will discuss two different lines of cases that are somewhat in tension with one another, but that ultimately support the point that I'm making. In one line of cases, the court holds fast to the idea that the press liberty is an individual liberty. And in a second line of cases, we'll see that the individual liberty is transformed into an institutional one. In the first line of cases, the individual liberty cases, the court found unconstitutional handbill ordinances that restricted the distribution of publication. And so in these cases, the court made very clear that it understood the freedom of the press as a fundamental personal right and liberty, and indeed went so far to make clear that it wasn't just referring to newspapers and periodicals when it thought about the press, but also to pamphlets and leaflets, the types of publication that an individual would hold and that an individual would hand out. Interestingly, in these cases, speech and freedom, or rather speech and press, were typically considered in conjunction with one another, so the court wasn't developing a standalone idea of the press. And in both of these cases, one of the petitioners in each case was a Jehovah's Witness, arguably infusing a sort of religious liberty element into these cases, though that was not a formal legal issue in either of the cases. Perhaps more important are this other line of cases in which the individual liberty of the right to the freedom of the press was transformed into an institutional one. The court acknowledged that the individual right is the point of departure for the freedom of the press, but it made an essential analytical move to apply the individual right to the organization or the institution of the press. The court operationalized this move by embracing the watchdog and informative functions of the press that the press had been articulating for itself at that moment. What's more, the highly divided 5-4 nature of many of these cases and the stringent, strident, substantive disagreements that the dissent and the majority engaged in underscores that the court was engaging in some novel doctrinal work. In my view, the court was coming to terms with the institutional press. We'll consider two cases that demonstrate this point. First is Neer versus Minnesota in 1931. In this case, a 5-4 court found unconstitutional a state nuisance statute that provided for injunctions of offensive newspapers and periodicals. In this case, the court made a very important move of applying what it defined as, quote, the essential personal liberty of the citizen, referring to the liberty of the press, to the press more broadly. This is clear not only because the defendants were newspaper editors who collectively represented the organization of the newspaper, but moreover because of how the court conceptualized the democratic stakes of vindicating the freedom of the press in American democracy. Specifically, the court articulated the need for a watchdog press, a role that only an institution could play. As the court explained, The administration of government has become more complex. The opportunities for malfeasance and corruption have multiplied, and so forth, emphasizing the primary need of a vigilant and courageous press. This is the image of the fourth estate. A beat reporter could not satisfy the sort of functions that the court is thinking of here. Only an institution could. Indeed, the novel work that the court is doing here was underscored by Justice Butler's dissent, in which he said the majority, quote, gives to the freedom of the press a meaning and scope not heretofore recognized. I couldn't agree with him more. Again, in a second case decided just a few years later called Grosjean, a unanimous court decided a case about the constitutionality of a newspaper tax. In this case, the court touted both the watchdog and informative functions that the press had been articulating about itself. Most importantly, the court's conceptualization of press liberty as an institutional liberty rooted in an individual right came full circle, whereby the vindication of the individual right happened through the institutional right. The court expressed it as follows: a free press stands as one of the great interpreters between the government and the people. To allow it to be fettered is to fetter ourselves. The institution of the press and the protection of its freedom of the press is the way in which the individual liberty of press freedom was fulfilled. So to recap, at the moment when the press was constituting itself as an institution, the court began to think of the press in those terms. The court expressed both the watchdog and informative functions that the press had been articulating about itself, and even more importantly, began conceiving of this individual right as an institutional one. So finally, I'll move to the last section of my presentation, where I discuss the policy implications. So what? This insight matters because it helps us to understand why courts and lawmakers see the modern press the way they do, as an institution. And it helps us to understand why that view might be limited, because it is socially and historically contingent, especially at a moment when the press itself is changing, arguably deinstitutionalizing. The policy stakes are perhaps most salient in the context of the recent federal shield legislation, where Congress defined who counted as a journalist, and thus who could qualify for legal protections of keeping their sources anonymous so narrowly as to exclude entire categories of journalists. Even though the most recent version of the bill is dead, Congress promulgates these bills every few years. It did in 2007, 2009, and 2013. So it's not totally moot to consider the issue. Congress will likely consider this again. We'll be looking at the language in the 2013 version, both because it's most recent and because I was personally involved in critiquing and lobbying to change the language in the bill through my work as a legal intern at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So to get to this point, I'll walk through the evidence by looking at the language in the bill and how amendments to the bill changed the text in order to see the way in which the lawmakers who were drafting the bill understood the press as an institution. So the bill was called the Free Flow of Information, the Free Flow of Information Act of 2013. As you can see, both the House and Senate versions thought of the journalist being protected as an institutional journalist. The House version required that a covered person, or the euphemistic language used to define journalist, do their work for financial gain or livelihood. And the Senate version required that journalists do this sort of work on a regular basis. Both bills suggested that the covered person definition included that person's supervisor, employer, parent company, subsidiary, or affiliate. These bills effectively required individuals to do journalism for money on a consistent basis under the auspices of a corporate parent, painting a picture of a New York Times correspondent, not a freelancer, not a blogger. In August of 2013, during a committee markup, Senator Feinstein introduced an amendment that reportedly sought to restrict the scope of who could be protected by the bill to quote-unquote real reporters, including an additional limitation that required these individuals be affiliated with a news entity, again, evidencing an institutional view of the press. Then the next month, in September 2013, the Senate Judiciary Committee passed another amendment and finally passed the bill out of committee. In this version, there was an improvement. The salaried requirement was dropped. The bill was better. But still, there was an institutional view, and the way in which Senator Feinstein described her amendment and the purpose behind it was to, quote, ensure that people who really aren't reporters at all, like the 17-year-old who drops out of high school, buys a website for $5, and starts a blog, are not protected. This is the institutional view of the press. Indeed, the language used in the bills are evocative of this sort of press, but not this kind of press. This is why the bills were bad policy. They constricted the scope of who counts as press at the very moment that the institution is breaking down and opening up to more people. Arguably, this is path dependency at its worst, following a status quo understanding of who counts as the press, privileging those in power at the very moment that the reality on the ground is changing. While I wouldn't say that everyone in this picture is necessarily a journalist, it's a debate that we need to have. And it's a debate that should not be foreclosed on because of path-dependent behavior. The upshot of my research is hopefully to jolt lawmakers and judges out of their path-dependent behavior so they don't take for granted the received wisdom of who or what the press is. It's to urge legal and communication scholars alike to attend to how we might be reproducing the status quo within our own work. And it's to call on journalists, both institutional and otherwise, to actively participate in their own redefinition. When it comes to who's able to speak, who does so with legal protections, and who doesn't, there's quite a lot at stake. Thanks.
We have a few minutes for questions and comments. Please be as brief as you can so we can accommodate as many people as possible. And with questions, if you could direct it to a particular member of the panel, that would speed things along.
Hello? Oh, it works. I'm going to test this by asking the first question, if that's okay with you. So, Victor, I know you wanted to end on a happy note, and we all appreciate that. And you sort of said that the lesson, the takeaway that we could take away from the 40s and what happened in the 40s was that public engagement counts. And in legislative processes and that kind of thing. But I also sort of saw a darker message, which was it seemed like for all the radical and interesting ideas in the Blue Book and the other reforms you mentioned, none of them actually passed, right? So what could we take away from a media situation that you pointed out is actually quite similar to some of the challenges we face today?
Thank you. I'll try to answer that really quickly, but that's going to be a challenge. And sorry, I'm not hello.
So your answer is read the book, right?
I'll try this one. Here we go. Does this work? Okay. All right. Here we go. Yes, you're right that most of the reform initiatives in the 40s were not successful. It was a little bit more nuanced. You did get the fairness doctrine, which was used to varying degrees of success for a few decades after that point. You also had the 45 AP decision, which really did articulate, as I mentioned briefly before, this alternative vision, saying that is the role of the government to encourage diverse and antagonistic voices in the press. So I do think some good things came out of the 40s. Much of it was crushed by this red baiting, this sort of coercive reaction from various quarters. I think the lesson there, though, is that we do need to keep our eyes on the structural narrative here, and that's a concern with net neutrality, is that it's not addressing things like the digital divide, it's not addressing the power of internet monopolies in our country. So I think that's something that we can learn, both how reformers in the 40s tried to maintain this structural critique and how they lost it. I think we can learn from that.
Thanks.
Other questions?
I had a similar question. To build off of that, what would be any practical sort of suggestions for today's environment, internet environment? Would you have any sort of ideas about this? And one question for the commissioner before did you have any, you said 4 million people participated into this amendment. What was the experience? How did it work? Was it successful, and how much? To what degree? Thank you for the.
So anytime you have 4 million people, many that previously were disengaged, I think that's successful. It really showed that, people are still recognize that the freedoms and the openness that we have in this country, you cannot, take it for granted. That this enabling platform that has just revolutionized the world, some of the issues and the concerns that we might have had on other platforms, honestly, it could take shape there if we're not careful. The professor, mentioned earlier about my takeaway from what he said, and it's burning, and it. When you talk about the First Amendment, when you talk about open internet, when you talk about rules that codify our experience, it's created by us. And so for those who talk about a solution in search of a problem, I say a part of the reason why you have this openness is because there was a template, one of the template already established. So and I wanted to come up with this, being on this academic campus, I wanted to come up with a word that when I do, I'm going to email, blast it to everyone. That to me, that divorce, being divorced from that type of reality that says, assuming that all of the things that we enjoy, came organically at the snap of a finger, it's just realistic. So I kind of over-answered your question, but it's at the core of saying that people care about the ability to express themselves, the ability to have more access to information and education and healthcare. I'm going to take a little exception to what the professor said about the not being able to address the digital divide. In essence, maybe I'm reading too much. In terms of the open internet platform, if you sift through the 300+ pages, what you will find is the FCC's enhanced ability to reform universal service, which in essence addresses the digital divide, to make sure that those with disabilities and special needs, that we have the ability, there's a backstop there to, and not trying to contradict you, but just to further enhance the discussion. How about that? I think that this would, this particular, when it goes into effect, because technically it's not in effect yet, it's got to go through the Federal Register. You guys know, Professor Barber knows, who I didn't acknowledge, who I know at the college, because I can rarely say her. I got the Van part, but when you get three, anyway, you know how to say your name. But when we talk about this, it is really important that we know that we have regulatory and other backstops that enable, all of the things that we enjoy, and we can never lose sight of that. I'm sorry about taking up too much time. And I think you had a part of it.
Really briefly, and thank you for that enhancement, that correction. I totally agree. That's a very good point. And the only thing I would add about practical lessons that we can learn is, well, one is that we need to make sure the public remains engaged. That's a concern that people declare victory after the net neutrality decision, and many of these problems will continue. And I think the other thing is to realize that media reform has to be a central part of your political program. Whatever your first issue is, your second issue needs to be about changing the media system and creating alternatives, public alternatives.
And we have an open item on that, and in terms of, we have a quadrennial review, which is, we chuckle because the next one, the chair plans to render a decision in 2016, so there is still opportunity to weigh in. We are considering maybe modifying some of the rules, which we are supposed to do every 4 years. There's opportunity to weigh in. So you're right.
Great. More questions?
Hi. Thank you for your presentations. They were really awesome. I'm a Knight Fellow here at Stanford, but I've also been a public school teacher. And many of the students that I've taught are in high poverty schools of color where their main access to the internet is in a computer lab that has firewalls. The walls of the ghetto are very, very high. And they're firewalls that they literally cannot see pictures of the NASA, the Hubble telescope, because there are concerns that these students are going to be going to inappropriate websites, and basically they have First Amendment rights that are not honored in the school setting. So I'm wondering, what the FCC, what the commission, whether or not you're aware of this, are you working on this part of the digital divide and what you're doing to preserve First Amendment rights for minors who are citizens?
One of the things that I am proud of that will not get a lot of press, that will probably get me further demonized, but I will take the hit, is the Lifeline program. And I mention it in this context because the Lifeline program has been demonized. But if properly reformed and modernized, this program, which is the only universal service, means-based, qualifier program that we have, if we do it right, we could target funding to enable subsidies, and I will say the word because I don't think it's a bad word, to flow to those who need it the most. Right now, it stands at $9.25. In this state, it is more robust. And I am a proponent of saying whatever the subsidy is from your state and from the federal government, you should be able to say where it's going. If you want to have broadband at home, I think that should follow you. So these are the things that we're talking about, reforming the Lifeline program. I would love to talk to you offline about what we can do to set that up, because I think that is the key for that funding to follow, that family or that, person and enable internet at home, because you know what the stats are, and you know the people who do not have broadband at home, why they don't. It's primarily economic.
Sorry, typical journalist, I'm going to ask a follow-up.
That's all right.
I don't know that it's really a money decision. I think sometimes it's just school districts with their own district-by-district incredibly arcane policies that just restrict and what students can do with existing equipment that is already internet-ready. I guess I'm wondering, is there anything the FCC is doing in the area of education to sort of level that playing field? Because you can go to a private school that has no restrictions at all, and a public school that's just around the corner that's literally not allowing their kids to use Twitter.
So one of the things that I'm not sure how much you have escalated your concerns to the district. So if, I'm an escalator by nature, you could probably tell by my mannerisms. So if you don't get, I would say, the proper responses, I always tell people, if you have an issue that's communications related that may or may not be under the FCC's jurisdiction, it's not a complaint unless you file it or if you let us know. So if you feel that this is something that needs more robust attention, we've got an E-rate program that is a universal service fund program that I'm sure that school is in, that's connected because of it. If there is a glitch or a firewall that you think is too high, let's talk about that. So we've got two things to follow up on after we.
Final question? Andreas?
I have a final question, too, so you and I can fight about it. No, you can go first.
General question to the panel, and I'd like to hear Morgan's view as well. It seems to me that net neutrality is a very basic sort of first block for creating an internet that promotes equality. And I'm wondering what can be done, or what do you think about other sources of structural inequality? For example, Matthew Heinemann, a professor, I remember at the university, talks about how the structure of the internet and the information on the internet is dominated by a few big conglomerates like Facebook and Google. And would net neutrality address that problem, or are there any other ways to address that issue there?
So I would say that there are other ways to address that issue that we're talking about in terms of access. Access to people regardless of where they live or the income, regardless of the platform. The one reason I push so much for mobile parity, and I know that sounds a little esoteric, but having the ability, no matter how you sign on, that is protected and enhanced, and that there are rules governing that, is because we know, particularly with communities that might have economic challenges, this may be it, and so. All of the programs that we're talking about and we talk around in terms of diversity by way of innovation and investment, all of these things are positive ripples. And so there's no one, two, or three things, and the FCC is not going to be the primary savior in this space, with all due respect. But the types of, this type of dialogue, which will lead to, other type of investment, which will lead to, hopefully us not having a very narrow definition of what success is, where access should be, and the like. I think all of those things will go a long way in realizing that this isn't an enabling platform. But I always say, as again, a daughter of the South who uses this word very sparingly, it's agnostic. And when we talk about this platform in particular, it is what, and when you talk about journalism, it is what society is. It's a reflection of society. It just makes it and us more efficient. It's not going to, to be the game changer. We're going to have to be, the stimulators and the conduits and the stirrers of the pot, so to speak. This platform just gets us there quicker. It's what we input that's going to make a difference.
Morgan?
Sort of building on this idea of agnosticism, I think the law is not agnostic. And that's part of the point that I was seeking to tease out with my research is the law sees journalists not as created equal. They're seen very differently. An institutional journalist is seen differently than someone else, someone like a blogger or a freelancer. And so to your very good question, Andreas, I think having the law recognize that there are assumptions built into the way in which decisions have been made over time, where the press has become defined as an institution in ways that exclude other voices, that's one step that can be taken both with the court and with lawmakers, and I discussed the context of the federal shield legislation, but there are other contexts in which this matters, to ensure that the problem that Matthew Hinman points out can be alleviated. Obviously, structural inequality is a multi-headed beast, but this is, I think, one important and overlooked way that the problem could be addressed.
Victor, if you'd like, you get the final word.
Oh, no, that puts pressure on me. I'll just say, I don't think it should count as the final word, but I think there's usually a two-pronged approach to the problem that you outlined there with internet monopolies. And one would be an antitrust approach, and I don't talk about that as much. I would look more at creating these alternative models like municipal broadband, which was the other great decision on February 26th, aside from net neutrality, in some ways as important, if not more. And if the FCC could continue to try to preempt these state laws that forbid or make very difficult municipalities getting in to offer internet services to local communities, that would be huge. So I think that's a good example. Thanks.
Great,
Thanks
nice.
to the panel, and please join us outside for the
Wait,
reception.
Yes, I was going to say, my last question is anybody hungry? Because we have a great reception.
Great, thank you.
Nice.